Dr. Greg, there are still people talking about the series of debates that you had with Sean Carroll a while back. Things written about that. It's being studied and looked at. Go to reasonablefaith.org as well for information. And Don Page, who you can introduce, wrote an open letter to you and to Sean Carroll and gave his thoughts on the debate.
Yes.
Don Page.
He is a very eminent cosmologist. He has collaborated with Stephen Hawking in the past. He's at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. And when I've had occasion to speak at the University of Alberta, I've been able to sit down with Don over lunch and talk through some of the issues in cosmology. It's been helpful to me. We correspond by email from time to time on various issues. And he's a Christian. He is a quite conservative Christian, but he's also very eccentric. He holds some really off-the-wall views, I have to say. He believes that everything is determined. He is a complete fatalist.
Really?
Who doesn't think that anything else is logically possible than what actually is. So he's got some really, really strange views. And he's been very resistant to the efforts of Christian philosophers to try to disabuse him of some of these views. So Don is he's a kind of a wild guy, but he's brilliant, and it was a privilege to have him take the time to read the transcript of the Carroll debate and then to offer some comments on it.
By the way, there's a Molinism group on Facebook, and I don't see Dr. Page joining that anytime soon.
Probably not. He'd be very reformed.
He says that he is really kind of a combination. His views fall as a combination of both you and Carroll's. But he says in this open letter that he wrote that was on Sean Carroll's blog and so on, I tend to be skeptical of philosophical arguments for the existence of God, since I do not believe there are any that start with assumptions universally accepted.
I thought that was a remarkable statement, Kevin. No natural theologian that I know of would say that in order to be a successful piece of natural theology, you have to have an argument based upon assumptions that are universally accepted. I mean, that would be preposterous. So, of course, one is skeptical for arguments for God's existence if they have to have assumptions or premises that are universally accepted. So this is a very odd sort of reservation that he expresses about the project of natural theology. No one would set the bar that high for success in natural theology. What you would say is that the premises need to be probably true, or maybe more plausibly true than false, or something of that sort, but you wouldn't say that the premises need to be universally accepted.
And he says he has his own argument for the existence of God that he presents. It's called the optimal argument for God. And he says, quoting now, I mainly think philosophical arguments might be useful for motivating someone to think about theism in a new way and perhaps raise the prior probability someone might assign to theism.
And that's very valuable, isn't it?
Yes.
If these philosophical arguments can motivate people to reconsider the existence of God in a new way, that's a huge accomplishment, I think. And then he even says it might raise the prior probability of the existence of God. And by that he means the intrinsic probability that God exists. Apart from specific evidence, what is just the probability of God based on the background information? He seems to think that these arguments could increase that probability. Well, again, I would esteem that to be a success in natural theology. Now, notice what he goes on to say, Kevin. He follows that sentence by saying, I do think that if one assigns to theism not too low a prior probability, the historical evidence for the life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus can lead to a posterior probability for theism being quite high. Well, now that's enormously successful in natural theology. What he's saying is that if the probability of theism on the background information alone isn't real low, even if it is low, it's less than 50%, the probability that God exists. But if it's not too low, he thinks that the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus could raise that probability up above 50%, so that it is now probable that God does exist and is indeed quite high. So that just completely changes the picture, I think. Even if there are no philosophical arguments from premises that are universally accepted, here Don is himself presenting a cumulative case for Christian theism that results in the probability of the Christian God's existing being quite high. Well, no apologist could ask for more than that.
True. And he says that he tends to favor a Bayesian approach. We need to do a podcast on that theorem.
Well, we've already been implicitly talking about Bayes' theorem, which is just the probability calculus, where you would assess the probability of a hypothesis given the information, your background information, and then given the specific evidence and so forth. And so the argument that he gave would be such an approach based on probability.
Okay. Now, where are his, what are his oppositions here, Bill, as we look at this? He agreed with you on some things, didn't agree on some other things. Can you get a bead on what it is that he's disagreeing with?
Well, he doesn't really interact much with the debate. He uses this blog more as an opportunity to share his own grounds for theism based upon, for example, the simplicity and the elegance of the laws of nature. He thinks that it may well be the case that the simpler hypothesis is theism and that therefore that's to be preferred. But he does eventually get around to the arguments from the origin of the universe and from the fine-tuning of the universe and offers some critique. So here's what he has to say with regard to the Kalam cosmological argument based upon the beginning of the universe. He says, in view of these beliefs of mine, I am not convinced that most philosophical arguments for the existence of God are very persuasive. Now, remember, that is based upon thinking that to be persuasive, it has to be based on assumptions that are universally accepted. Well, I would agree with him with respect to that. But here he says, I am highly skeptical in particular of the Kalam cosmological argument. Why? What is the basis of his skepticism? Well, he says, I do not believe that the first premise is metaphysically necessary. But then he adds, though I suppose I would believe it is true in the actual world. So the reason he gives for rejecting the causal premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause is that he doesn't think that's metaphysically necessary, but he does think that it's true. Now, all the proponent of the argument needs is that it's true. You don't need that it's true in every possible world, that it's metaphysically necessary, though I think that it is. But you don't have to believe the first premise is metaphysically necessary. You just have to believe that it's true, and the argument will go through.
Okay.
But then the second reason he gives, Kevin, is, and I'm quoting, I am not at all sure that our universe had a beginning. And again, I would say certainty is not the proper measure here. The question is it more probable than not that the universe began to exist? And even a skeptic like Lawrence Krauss was willing to say, in my dialogue with him, that yeah, on balance, I think the universe probably began to exist. Now, one might ask, Kevin, why is he skeptical about that causal premise? Or why does he think it's not metaphysically necessary that whatever begins to exist has a cause? Well, here's what he says. He says, I agree that just from our experience of the one-way causation we observe within the universe, which is just a merely effective description and not fundamental, we cannot logically derive the conclusion that the entire universe has a cause, since the effective unidirectional causation we commonly experience is something just within the universe and need not be extrapolated to a putative cause for the universe as a whole. Now, what is he talking about here? What he's claiming, Kevin, is that if you adopt a tenseless view of time, a B theory of time, where all events in time are equally real, he says there's no reason to think that causation just runs one way, from past to later. It would be equally possible for causation to run from later to the past. Now, that assumes that tenseless view of time, which I reject. As I pointed out in the debate, the Kalam cosmological argument assumes from start to finish that time is tense. That is to say, that temporal becoming is an objective and real feature of the universe, that the universe really did come into being at the first moment of its existence. And if that's right, it would be impossible for there to be a later cause of it, because that would then be to come out of nothing, because that later cause doesn't exist. You can't say that the origin of the universe was caused by something later than it, because there isn't anything at that point later than it. So the unidirectional nature of causation is based not in the laws of nature or in science. It is based in the objectivity of temporal becoming, that things come into being and elapse one after another. And that's why causation is unidirectional. So his reservations about the first premise, Kevin, are not scientific. I mean, once again, we see it's philosophical. It has to do with the nature of time and the nature of causation. And I'm ready to go to the mat in defense of the tensed theory of time and hence the unidirectional nature of causation.
Okay.
Now, what's odd again is that Don takes back with one hand what he gave with the other. In the next paragraph, he then goes on to say, I have a hunch that God created a universe with apparent unidirectional causation in order to give his creatures some dim picture of the true causation that he has in relation to the universe he has created. But I do not see any metaphysical necessity in this. So here he is willing to affirm that true causation is unidirectional from God to the universe. God brought the universe into being, and he thinks that the first premise is in fact true, that whatever begins to exist has a cause, but he doesn't see metaphysical necessity in this. That's because he doesn't think it's metaphysically necessary that God exists. He agrees with Swinburne that God is a contingent entity and doesn't exist metaphysically necessarily.
Yeah, he says, and I do believe, like Richard Swinburne, that God is concrete and not logically necessary, the ultimate brute fact.
Right.
Now,
right.
when I was thinking about brute facts, I always thought that if something were the ultimate brute fact, that it would be metaphysically necessary. You know, I mean,
No, not on Swinburne's view. Brute in this case simply means it has no explanation.
yeah,
But not because it's metaphysically necessary, but because it is a contingent, inexplicable fact. And that's the sense in which it's brute. It's just a brute fact. So Swinburne is willing to say that God is the ultimate explanation of why the world exists, but that God is not metaphysically necessary. He is contingent, but there just isn't any explanation for why this contingent state of affairs obtains rather than not. So it's a very odd minority position within Christian philosophy that would hold that God is a contingent being whose existence is just a brute fact. But Don, as I say, is very eccentric, and he buys into this view. And that supplies the reasons why he thinks the first premise of the argument, whatever begins to exist has a cause, isn't metaphysically necessary, but he does think that it's true.
So one can think that God is the ultimate brute fact, or that the universe is the ultimate brute fact?
Right. That would be the key. And then Swinburne will argue that the God hypothesis is preferable because it's simpler. And remember, Page seems sympathetic with that. Remember earlier on in his post, he argues that God loves simplicity and elegance, and that therefore he thinks theism could well be simpler than naturalism. And so it's the preferred brute contingent fact rather than the brute contingent fact of the universe.
One more time on this, Bill. He says, I have a hunch that God created a universe with apparent unidirectional causation in order to give his creatures some dim picture of the true causation.
Now, I already read that one.
Yeah. What I was going to say is, it sounds like God is being deceptive there. Is he, would God give us a sense of something that's not actually true?
I do think it is rather deceptive, because on the tense-less theory of time, temporal becoming is an ineradicable delusion of human beings. We are, all of us, hopelessly deluded by the illusion that events happen one after another, that things come into being and go out of being, and he thinks God has created us to have this illusion, and that the only true causation is the causation of God to the world, which isn't illusory. But I mean, if that makes you take a deep breath, listen to the next paragraph. Yet another hunch I have, Don says, is that it is actually sentient experiences rather than created individual persons that are fundamental. But God created our experiences to include beliefs that we are individual persons, to give us a dim image of Him as the one true person. So he thinks that we don't really exist as persons. What really exists are just these experiences. And God gives you this delusory belief, or he includes this delusory belief among the experiences that I am a person. But in fact, God is really the only person that exists. And the rest is just illusory experiences that include the illusion of being an individual person. So as I say, Don has some really radical views.
Yeah, well, before that,
and this is one of them.
He said he has another hunch that God created us with the illusion of liberty, libertarian free will, as true freedom. So
as a picture of the true freedom that he has, right? So he thinks that, again,
God is
freedom
deceiver.
of the will is illusory.
Yeah.
So boy, on Don's view, God has really kind of done a job on his creatures. He's created all these illusions. To what end, I wonder? And I wonder what. I was just going to say, what would the implications of Don's view be for Jesus of Nazareth? Is he a person? And I suppose Don would say he's a person because he's a divine person. But that would mean that this divine person came incarnate and had interactions with all these this illusory world, even though he was a genuine person.
He's 100% God and 100% illusory man.
Well, he would say, I suppose, that he has these illusory human experiences. But the only person is the divine person, and that's Orthodox Christology. There is no human person, Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ is a divine person with a human nature. So that would be Orthodox, but it does kind of make you think about the ramifications of his view.
Well, Bill is skeptical about the first premise of the Kalam, now skeptical of the second premise that the universe had a beginning. He says, quoting now, on the issue of whether our universe had a beginning, besides not believing that this is at all relevant to the issue of whether or not God exists, I agreed almost entirely with Sean's points rather than yours, Bill, on this issue. We simply do not know whether or not our universe had a beginning. But there are certain models, such as Sean's with Jennifer Chin, that do not have a beginning. And then he says, I favor a bounce model. So,
right. So here he expresses skepticism with regard to whether the universe had a beginning. And as Jim Sinclair, I think, has shown in our Blackwell Companion article, while there certainly are models like Sean Carroll's that do not feature a beginning, those models have been shown repeatedly to be untenable. They are either mathematically or empirically untenable, so that these are not good models of the origin of the universe. They're not plausibly true. And that's why, as you remember in the debate, I quote Vilenkin, who examines these various models that are beginningless and comes to the conclusion that none of these is a good model of the universe. Vilenkin says that the evidence says that all the evidence we have says that the universe had a beginning. So it's not enough just to have models of the universe that are beginningless. The question is, are these models viable, true descriptions of the way the universe is? And there I think the evidence really goes against them and supports models that have a beginning.
I noticed, Bill, that Dr. Page doesn't really interact with the philosophical arguments for a finite past.
Well, that's because those weren't featured in the debate.
Okay.
In this debate, it was on the evidence of cosmology, and I thought it would be unfair to try to argue philosophically when Sean Carroll is a cosmologist. So I made a concerted effort to stay in his field of expertise, in his area of specialization, so that I couldn't be accused of trying to bring in philosophical things.
Yeah.
And so it was so interesting that he continued to bring up philosophical questions when I tried to stick to the science in the debate, and offered criticisms of his model in particular as to why I thought it was not a successful model for a beginningless universe.
And Bill, he mentioned that his view is can be called the bounce model of cosmology. Expound on that a little bit.
What he imagines, as I recall, is an infinite contraction down to a kind of minimum bottleneck, and then followed by an expansion, so that if you had a space-time diagram of the universe, it would look kind of like an hourglass, where the lower part of the hourglass represents the universe's contracting from eternity past, reaching the narrow neck of the hourglass, and then re-expanding to eternity future. This is the same move that Carroll makes in the Carroll-Chen model. And what I pointed out is that this model faces a fundamental dilemma. If you say that the arrow of time is determined by the thermodynamic arrow of increasing entropy, then what you have in this hourglass model is not one universe. You have two universes expanding in opposite directions, mirror universes, one expanding down, so to speak, the bottom part of the hourglass, and the other one expanding up. You do not have a contraction followed by an expansion. You have two universes with a common origin expanding in different directions. That is the case if you take seriously that the arrow of entropy increase is the arrow of time, which is what Sean Carroll does. If, on the other hand, you say, no, that's just a physical device that we humans use for clock purposes, it's just our timekeeping convention, But in fact, that's not really the arrow of time. In that case, Kevin, what you would have would be an arrow of time that goes from the lower part of the hourglass through the neck to the upper part of the hourglass. And that is thermodynamically impossible, because then you have a universe which, contrary to the second law of thermodynamics, is decreasing in entropy for infinite time as time goes on, until it reaches the hourglass bottleneck and then re-expands. And that's thermodynamically impossible, and it would result in all sorts of chaos before the bottleneck is reached. There have been multiple studies of this that show that this kind of contracting model just doesn't work, and Vilenkin speaks to this as well. Now, Page's defense here is to say that this hourglass is not two universes expanding in opposite directions like mirror universes, because you can trace a timeline from the first one through the bottleneck and into the lower one. And my response to that, Kevin, is to say that that is just a geometrical fact. You have a space-time geometry that shrinks down and then expands out again, and you can draw your geometrical lines through it. But that doesn't represent time. If you say that the direction of time is the direction of entropy increase, in that case you actually do have two mirror universes with a common origin. And the fact that there can be a geometrical line from one to the other is just irrelevant to whether events in the lower hourglass are earlier than or later than the events in the upper hourglass. So I think that the proponents of this model face a very deep dilemma here that will result in the model either being physically impossible, or else it will be a model that still posits an origin of the universe.
Don Page on fine-tuning.
On fine-tuning, Don is also unsympathetic. He says that I objected to your probability estimates for various things regarding fine-tuning. Now, why does he reject that? Because, as Luke Barnes has shown, the vast majority of physicists would recognize that fine-tuning is a fact of physics and that these parameters are highly improbable in the values they take. Well, he says probabilities depend on the theory or model. So without a definite model, one cannot claim that the probability for some feature like fine-tuning is small. Now, I'm not sure what Don means when he says that the probabilities are dependent upon a model, because what I was talking about when I said that to explain the fine-tuning, you would have to adopt some non-standard measure of probability. What I meant was, if you have this world ensemble of universes, and some of them are finely tuned, the proportion of those that are finely tuned is infinitesimal compared to the whole thing. And of those that are observable, the vast, vast majority, again, of the observable universes, the proportion of the observable universes that are fine-tuned is again going to be infinitesimal. Most of them will be Boltzmann brane worlds. And what I meant when I said to escape this conclusion you would need a non-standard probability is that you would have to adopt some theory of probability that would say that even though these finely tuned worlds are a tiny, tiny proportion of all of the worlds, for some unknown reason they're more probable. And that's why a finely tuned universe exists. And that's correct. All Don is saying is that Boltzmann branes are more probable in certain models than in others, and that may be the case. But the point is that in a multiverse of worlds, that thermodynamics requires that these Boltzmann branes are going to dominate, that most of the observable worlds will be these Boltzmann brane worlds. And so unless you have some non-standard measure of probability that would make these worlds more probable, you're going to have to say that it's vastly, vastly improbable that a finely tuned universe like this should exist. And so I don't think that he has escaped the Boltzmann brain problem here.